In a quiet neighborhood, an elderly black woman living alone, known for always cooking for her neighbors, led a quiet but warm life. One rainy night, she opened her door to a 10-year-old boy, shivering and bruised, running from an abusive stepfather. She didn't ask questions, just brought him in, fed him, protected him, and called the police. Years later, that same boy, now a federal judge, returned to repay her and asked to call her mom. Before we dive into this incredible story, let us know where you're tuning in from. We absolutely love to hear your thoughts and connect with our viewers across the globe. Drop a comment below and tell us what resonates with you. In the quiet corner of a Georgia neighborhood where porches creaked with the gentle passage of time and magnolia trees bowed gracefully over cracked sidewalks, there stood a modest little house at the end of Willow Street. It wasn't grand nor freshly painted, but it possessed something no real estate agent could ever hope to list: a soul. The walls, though worn by the years, had absorbed decades of laughter, the uplifting melodies of gospel music, and the sweet, comforting scent of baked cornbread that seemed to perpetually hover around the windows, like an invisible welcome mat woven into the very air itself. This was the cherished home of Mama Rose. Mama Rose wasn't anyone famous in the conventional sense. She didn't display prestigious degrees on her walls or drive anything newer or fancier than her reliable, albeit weathered, Ford pickup truck that always seemed to wheeze and complain on cold mornings. But everyone on Willow Street and in the neighboring areas knew exactly who she was. Some affectionately referred to her as the Porch Saint, recognizing her quiet acts of kindness, while others simply and reverently called her Mama. She had a unique and special way about her, a warmth and genuineness that made you feel instantly welcomed and like you belonged, even if you were just passing by for a moment. Mama Rose was, in her own humble estimation, 50 years old, though you'd rarely, if ever, hear her utter those numbers aloud. Age for her was not a burden to be lamented or a source of insecurity, but rather something she gracefully wore like a beloved old quilt, faded in places, perhaps and patched with countless memories, but still undeniably warm, comforting, and beautiful in its own unique way. She lived alone, not due to any misfortune or lack of companionship, but by her own quiet and deliberate choice. Her husband had passed away many decades ago, leaving a void that time had softened but never fully erased. And her children were scattered across various states and bustling cities, caught up in the demands of their jobs, the responsibilities of their own families, and the complexities of their own individual lives. But Mama Rose never allowed loneliness to find a foothold or a comfortable place to settle within the walls of her house. Her table was always lovingly set for more than just herself, anticipating the arrival of unexpected guests and cherished company. Strangers drawn in by her open heart and welcoming spirit invariably became neighbors. Neighbors blossomed into extended family, and family, well, she never truly let go of family. Not in her heart. Not really, regardless of distance or time. That particular day had unfolded much like any other. A gentle golden light spilled generously across her flourishing garden, where vibrant red tomatoes climbed diligently up handmade fences and leafy collard greens reached eagerly for the sun-drenched sky. She hummed a familiar hymn as she lovingly stirred a large pot of gumbo, the rich and fragrant aroma filling her kitchen with an irresistible invitation. Every motion of her hand was a quiet and practiced ritual of love, passed down through generations. The old radio crackled softly in the corner, alternating between the smooth jazz of Louis Armstrong and bursts of static, but she found a comforting rhythm in the mix. She moved a bit more slowly now. Age had begun to take its inevitable share, presenting her with subtle reminders of its presence. But her heart still beat as young and fiercely as it ever had, full of compassion and unwavering strength. It was the kind of peaceful evening where nothing felt particularly urgent or pressing. Children rode their bicycles along the sidewalks on their way home, their laughter echoing in the fading light. Porch lights flickered on one by one like fireflies gradually waking up to illuminate the twilight, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, a solitary sound that quickly faded into the tranquil stillness. Mama Rose had just carefully pulled a perfectly brown skillet of cornbread from the warm oven, its crust a beautiful golden brown, and its aroma promising comfort when she heard it. The sound was soft, hesitant, barely more than a faint whisper of a knock against her sturdy wooden door. She paused in her movements, a sense of quiet curiosity washing over her. Not many people ventured to visit at this late hour. She thoughtfully wiped her hands on her well-worn apron, her heart not racing with alarm but definitely aware, possessing the kind of intuitive awareness that only women like Mama Rose, who had navigated the complexities of life with grace and wisdom, truly understood. Those who had witnessed enough to know that sometimes trouble didn't announce itself with a shout. Sometimes it arrived quietly, barely daring to breathe. She slowly made her way to the door and opened it, and in that single moment, everything she thought she knew about the predictable rhythm of peace subtly shifted. Standing there illuminated by the soft porch light was a boy no more than 10 years old, completely soaked from the persistent drizzle that had begun to fall. His small arms folded tightly across his chest in a futile attempt to ward off the chill. He was shivering uncontrollably, not just from the cold dampness of the evening, but from something deeper and far more profound. Something that spoke of fear and trauma. His skin was unusually pale stark against the dark bruises that marred his face. One eye swollen and puffed just slightly, the unmistakable kind of injury you don't sustain from simply tripping on a step or having a minor accident. His lips were cracked and dry, his clothes far too thin to provide adequate warmth against the evening air. But what truly broke Mama Rose's heart and stirred her deepest compassion was the way he looked at her. Not with the immediate and expected fear of a stranger, but with a profound and heartbreaking exhaustion, like someone who had been running for an impossibly long time, too far and for too long, and wasn't even sure if he had been running toward a glimmer of hope or simply desperately fleeing from the crushing weight of despair. He didn't speak a flurry of words, as one might anticipate from a frightened child. He didn't launch into a frantic explanation. He simply uttered 4 small but incredibly powerful words, each one carrying the weight of his desperate plea. Please don't make me go. And Mama Rose, without a moment's hesitation or a hint of doubt, reached out her hand. Not with a barrage of questions demanding immediate answers, not with a list of conditions that needed to be met, but with the unwavering certainty and instinctive compassion of someone who fundamentally understood that love didn't require lengthy explanations or detailed justifications. It simply required action. She gently took his cold hand in hers, pulled him inside, closed the door firmly but softly, and just like that, a new and unexpected chapter began. Not just for the vulnerable boy who had sought refuge on her doorstep, but also for the 72-year-old woman who had always steadfastly believed that the front door of a home was never intended to be a barrier that separated and excluded, but rather a welcoming bridge that connected and offered sanctuary. The door clicked shut behind them with a soft finality, a sound that seemed to resonate with a quiet significance, marking a clear division between one world and another. Inside Mama Rose's cozy kitchen, the warm and inviting amber light seemed to instinctively wrap itself protectively around the boy like a comforting shawl. The rich and homey scent of cornbread and simmering gumbo filled the air, immediately grounding the moment with a powerful sense of home and belonging, even as a palpable silence hung heavy between them, punctuated only by the soft sound of the rain against the windows. He stood hesitantly in the entryway, dripping a small puddle of water onto the faded linoleum floor. His arms still tightly crossed across his chest, his wide eyes darting nervously to each corner of the room, as if he half expected someone to suddenly leap out from the shadows and reclaim him. Mama Rose, with the wisdom that came from her 72 years of life, didn't rush him or pressure him to speak before he was ready. She understood the profound value of silence and the immense weight it could carry. She simply and patiently turned toward the stove, pulled a clean and soft dish towel from a nearby drawer, and set it gently on the table, offering a silent invitation before carefully ladling a generous portion of steaming soup into a wide ceramic bowl. "I made this with okra and smoked sausage," she said softly, her voice calm and reassuring, not looking directly at him to avoid any added pressure. "It's got a little bit of heat to it, but it's real kind and soothing to the belly." She placed the bowl down on the table, added a thick slice of cornbread still warm and fragrant from the oven, and then stepped back. Like a gracious host giving ample space to a guest who hadn't yet decided whether he felt safe enough to stay. The boy didn't move from his spot at first, his body language conveying a deep sense of uncertainty. Then cautiously and tentatively, like a stray animal testing the boundaries of trust, He slowly approached the table. His small fingers trembled slightly as he reached out and grasped the cool metal of the spoon. The first bite of soup came slowly and deliberately, almost suspiciously, as if he was waiting for an unpleasant surprise, but the second bite came quicker, followed by another and another. He still didn't speak, but his body began to tell its own story. The visible sag of his tense shoulders, the gradual slowing of his rapid breathing, the subtle flicker of disbelief that someone, a complete stranger, had actually prepared something warm and nourishing just for him. Mama Rose continued to watch him quietly from her position at the sink, gently wiping down a plate that was already clean, her kind and observant eyes never leaving him for a moment. The dark bruises that marred his thin arm, visible just beneath the damp sleeve of his t-shirt, told a more detailed and heartbreaking story than his young mouth could possibly bear. She had seen enough in her long years, witnessed the things that people often chose to ignore or pretend didn't exist, the harsh realities that the law sometimes overlooked, and the silent suffering that countless children were tragically forced to endure. When he had finally finished eating, he looked up at her for the very first time. And in the depths of his eyes, she saw the unspoken question he was still too scared to voice aloud. "Am I truly safe here?" She responded with a simple nod, delivered with the quiet certainty and reassurance of someone answering a heartfelt prayer rather than just acknowledging a glance. "You got a name, baby?" Her voice was like smooth velvet, but firm and grounded, the kind of voice that didn't take offense when met with silence or hesitation. The boy paused for a long moment, as if the simple act of revealing his name required a tremendous amount of courage. He then whispered, "Caleb!" The name came out hoarse and raspy, as if he hadn't used it in a long while. Or perhaps he had learned to stop saying it altogether when no one used it kindly or with affection. Mama Rose repeated it back to him, treating it with a reverence and care one might reserve for something sacred and precious. "Caleb," she said, her gentle smile finally reaching her warm eyes. "Oh, that's a strong and beautiful name. Strong like the roots of a mighty oak tree." He nodded once, his eyes flickering down towards his hands, his voice barely audible above the soft patter of the rain. "Please, ma'am, don't call nobody. I'll be good, I promise. I can't go back there." And there it was, the raw and vulnerable plea hidden beneath the layers of silence, the deep-seated terror wrapped in an attempt at forced obedience. Mama Rose stepped forward slowly and deliberately, her movements measured and calming. She reached into the drawer beside the refrigerator and carefully pulled out a faded and well-loved Afghan blanket, its colors softened by time and countless washings. She gently laid it over his small shoulders with the kind of tender care and unspoken affection that made him instinctively flinch, not because it caused him any physical pain, but because he wasn't accustomed to such gentle and loving touch. "I ain't sending you back there, sugar," she said firmly but calmly, her voice leaving no room for argument. "And not tonight, not ever back to any kind of danger, but I do have to call someone who has the resources and expertise to help you in the right way. You're safe and protected here until then, you hear me clearly?" His lip quivered slightly at her words, and for the first time since his arrival, a single tear escaped from his eye and slipped silently down his cheek. It didn't fall with a loud sob or dramatic outburst. It simply rolled down his face as if it had been patiently waiting for permission to finally emerge. Mama Rose cupped his delicate cheek gently in her hand, her thumb softly brushing away the tear with all the tenderness and reverence of a mother lovingly tucking in her own child for the night. She then left him at the kitchen table, wrapped in the comforting blanket, and stepped into the adjacent room, her movements quiet and purposeful. She picked up the old rotary phone that sat on a small table, the mechanism clicking softly with each turn of the dial as she carefully dialed the necessary numbers. Her voice was steady and clear as she calmly gave her name and address to the local police dispatcher, making a specific request, no, issuing a firm instruction, that an officer specially trained in child welfare respond to her call, and that no police uniforms or flashing lights be used so as not to further alarm or disturb the already frightened child who had only just begun to breathe freely again. By the time she returned to the living room, Caleb had curled up on a worn but comfortable couch, wrapped snugly in the warm Afghan blanket, the empty soup bowl resting neatly on the coffee table beside him. He was already drifting into a deep and exhausted sleep, the kind of sleep that only comes after enduring a long period of intense fear and uncertainty. Mama Rose quietly sat down on a nearby armchair, not saying a word, but offering her silent presence as a comforting promise, one hand resting lightly on his small shoulder. She knew that the complex systems designed to help often didn't get it right, that they were imperfect and flawed. But until the morning came and someone knocked on her door with answers and solutions, she would steadfastly hold the night like a protective shield around this vulnerable boy and make absolutely sure that for once in his young life, he was not utterly and completely alone. The hours of the night passed quietly and peacefully, wrapped in the soft and rhythmic ticking of the ancient wall clock that hung in the hallway and the occasional low groan of the wind as it brushed against the windows of her little house. Outside, the heavy rain had gradually slowed to a gentle whisper, the kind of drizzle that barely kissed the steps of the porch, but left the air thick with the weight of memory and unspoken emotions. Inside, Mama Rose didn't even consider sleeping. She remained seated in her worn but comfortable armchair across from the couch where Caleb lay, a knitted shawl draped over her shoulders for warmth, her hands folded calmly in her lap. Her kind and watchful eyes never once left Caleb's sleeping form. There was something deeply sacred and profound about the act of watching over someone who didn't yet possess the words or the confidence to properly ask for protection and safety. She had done it countless times before, in her long and compassionate life, fostered children in need, fed those who were hungry, and held far too many broken pieces together with her love and unwavering support. But this boy, this particular boy who had arrived on her doorstep in the midst of a stormy night, had walked into her life with a silence that seemed to shout volumes and a stillness that trembled with unspoken fear beneath every shallow breath. As the first hint of dawn began to gently press through the delicate lace curtains that adorned her windows, casting a softer and ethereal light into the room, she finally heard the anticipated knock on her door. It was firm and clear, but not aggressive or intimidating, and when she opened the door, she was relieved to see that her instructions had been followed precisely. There were no blaring sirens, no intimidating police uniforms, and no harsh floodlights to disrupt the quiet peace of the morning. A woman stood there, appearing to be in her mid-40s perhaps, with her hair pulled back neatly, a clipboard held firmly in her hand, and kind but alert eyes that conveyed both professionalism and genuine concern. Her name was Ms. Jenkins, and she introduced herself as a caseworker with the Department of Family and Children's Services. She spoke in low and measured tones, conveying respect and understanding, and Mama Rose immediately appreciated her calm and gentle approach. Caleb was still sound asleep on the couch, curled up beneath a warm blanket as if it were a protective cocoon. Mama Rose invited Ms. Jenkins inside, and they sat together in the kitchen, just out of earshot of the sleeping boy, sharing cups of weak but comforting coffee and exchanging the difficult truths of the situation. Mama Rose carefully and meticulously described the visible bruises, the palpable fear she had witnessed in Caleb's eyes, and the way he instinctively flinched at even the slightest gesture of kindness. Ms. Jenkins listened attentively, nodding slowly and taking detailed notes with a mechanical pencil that scratched softly against the surface of her clipboard. "He's run away before," she murmured, more to herself than to Mama Rose. But this time, someone actually opened the door and offered him shelter. When the time inevitably came to gently wake Caleb and begin the difficult process of discussing his situation, Mama Rose insisted on being the one to do it. She sat down quietly beside him on the couch, laid a gentle hand on his small shoulder, and whispered his name softly, her voice filled with a soothing quality, like a lullaby sung in reverse. He stirred slowly, his eyes fluttering open with the initial panic of someone expecting to be abruptly snatched away. But then he focused on Mama Rose's familiar face, and the fear in his eyes gradually eased, not completely vanishing, but becoming noticeably quieter. "Caleb, baby," she said softly, her voice filled with reassurance. "There's a very kind lady here who wants to help you. She ain't gonna hurt you, but we do need to talk a little bit about what happens next, okay?" He sat up slowly, his small arms wrapped tightly around his knees as if trying to protect himself. He didn't look directly at Miss Jenkins, his gaze fixed solely on Mama Rose.